Hello, Chicago. You guys hear me?
So, yeah.
There we go.
Good to see you.
Hey, Dave. There he is.
Hey, Patrick.
Hi. We don't hear Patrick.
The king of New York.
Patrick, we have to take off. In Chicago, you have to take off mute.
Hey everyone. Hey Jennifer. Hey J Mart.
Hey, Patrick.
Yo.
To the second IOP summer pop-up. School, college, university, school classes, whatever, are not in session. Why are we here? Because the news never stops. And so we have with us today to talk about the Democratic Party specifically, what's going on, unpack that mayor's race that happened before the 4th of July, that mayoral primary, talk about what that does or doesn't say about the rest of the country, and certainly about the Democratic Party. We're super lucky to have an all-star panel today. We have with us here in the room, David Wasserman, the senior editor and election analyst of the nonpartisan Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, putting together two of the most trusted analysts in the country. Joining us on Zoom up here is Jonathan Martin, the esteemed politics bureau chief and senior political columnist at Politico, and Patrick Gaspard, a longtime leader and strategist for the Democratic Party, most recently as president of the Center for American Progress and an advisor to Zohran Mamdani. So I guess the big question I want to start for all three of you is the one that we all in the room have, and all of us, hello to our virtual guests as well, is from your individual apertures on this race in New York City. What does this mean about the alignments within the party? Are there new alignments? Does this presage the midterm, special elections, other moments for the Democratic Party around the country? We know the party's been desperate to win back working class voters, union voters, to shift the message to one that shares a focus on affordability, on the difficulty so many voters have around obtaining housing, paying for childcare, dealing with inflation in a society that's so incredibly class divided. And at the same time, we have these countervailing moments, call it abundance, call it neolib, call it moderates running away from Zohran, whatever you want to call it. What's going on? Patrick, you were at the belly of that beast, so let's start with you.
I'm happy to be your first victim. And first, let me just thank you for the invitation, Jen. It's great to see your esteemed scholars in the room, and it's an honor to be on with Wasserman and with J Mart, who are a good deal smarter about all of this stuff than I am. First thing I'd say, though, Jennifer, is we all have to be extraordinarily careful about over projecting realignment or the impact of any individual race anywhere in America, most especially a New York City race. I'm old enough to remember when people like Joe Biden were hailing Eric Adams as the future of the Democratic Party and like the new course of trajectory for the center left, and that didn't work out as he had projected. I do think that there are a couple of things that are important about this race. One, it's a reminder that candidates matter. Zohran Mamdani is an extraordinary political athlete. He is gifted. He's one of those people that if you're around for just a few short minutes, you recognize the talent right away. You recognize the authenticity immediately, which is something that can't be shelf bought and store purchased. And you also understand that this is somebody who has a deep appreciation for the way public narrative has to meet policy making in a way to be effective and to build durable movements and durable majorities into the future. I'd also say that one of the things that I think is a lesson from this contest that has to be carried into other spaces is the laser-like focus on listenership. What do I mean by that? Way back in November of last year, immediately after Kamala Harris lost to Joe Biden, Zohran Mamdani begins to do this tour of colored communities in New York City, and he has a conversation with folks on the street. He records these conversations. He asks them what they did in the election, and a healthy number of them tell him that they voted for Donald Trump. He pushes into it, he interrogates it. Why'd you vote for Trump? And they resoundingly tell them it's because can't afford a $400 emergency. I'm underwater with my housing bills. I can't afford pre-K for my kids. I had a better feeling about the economy when that guy was in office, so I'm betting on him. Zohran Mamdani, after that listening ship, then put all his chips in the center of the table on the question of affordability, drilled down hard on that, and presented a message that was not left or right, but was outsider versus insider versus elite interests, and that proved to be effective. And I think that's a formula for races across the country.
Can you weigh in on that? Framing here that maybe we're not in the left-right moment right now, at least in that particular primary. And of course, that's New York City, so there's not as per se a left-right kind of frame.
Yeah. I think the tendency of the press to assign neat labels on voters it is routinely defied by the voters themselves, who don't view themselves as living neatly as right, left, or center. Voters tend to sort of live in the moment, and they most of them at least tend to sort of vote their preference oftentimes on identity and values as much as economics. But Patrick raises an important topic, which is, to me, the most striking part of last year's election in New York was the realignment of Hispanic and Asian voters, especially in Queens and parts of Brooklyn, and even a few places in the Bronx, away from the Democratic nominee and to Donald Trump. I can recall vividly talking to Grace Meng, who, as Patrick knows and as David knows, represents a really diverse district in Queens, including Flushing. And she had just a massive shift to Trump in her district. And I think what Mamdani did, which is important, is he made inroads with a lot of those first and second generation Hispanic and Asian communities, which I think insulated him. I don't think he's the nominee today if he had not sort of put the time and effort he did in those communities. I think he would have been much more of a limited kind of, frankly, white, young, hipster candidate who would not have been able to get the numbers he did. He still struggled in Black working class communities where Cuomo has obviously got good name ID, but he was able to overcome that, I think, because he did put so much time into going after those Trump voters that Patrick was talking about, who are not the Trump voters that we typically think of. Because again, full circle, they're not conservative or liberals. They just weren't happy with the status quo politically, and so they voted for Donald Trump. It's not like there's some outpouring of racism in Flushing, Queens. They're first and second generation Asian Americans. They just weren't happy with the moment. So yes, it's totally understandable that they would vote for Donald Trump one year and literally somebody from the DSA the next year. Welcome to New York. Welcome to America.
So we don't want to take too much, as Patrick says, from New York City and apply to the nation. But hey, that's the job. So tell us, what does this, if anything, what are some tea leaves? I mean, obviously, when we have had big political movements in the last 20 years in this country, Tea Party movement and so forth, at least in one place and it grows out. Dave, what's sort of your observation about what we can be looking at as we start to think about the next big elections and midterm elections?
I agree with everything Jay Martin and Patrick said. I would harken back to this point in 2017 and 2018, and there was another earthquake in New York and another meteoric rise of a Gen Z candidate back in 2018. It was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A big reason why those of us who were studying that district didn't predict at the time that she would upset Joe Crowley was that just 2 years earlier, that district, we saw Hillary Clinton cream Bernie Sanders in the presidential primary. And yet it flipped to a Democratic socialist candidate against a longtime incumbent in 2018. And I think that also speaks to the fact that voters look at their choices through a less ideological lens than the national media often frames these races. And back then, that was followed up by Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, and the rise of the Squad. And Rashida Tlaib, but that didn't necessarily mean that Democrats as a party were lurching left, because the center of gravity of the Democratic Party is not Manhattan or even Queens or the Bronx. It is more like suburban New Jersey or Westchester County or some of the districts where there are an awful lot of voters who will be deciding key races in 2026, who will be determining who the Democratic nominee is in 2028. And I don't think what we're seeing is a socialist revolt. I kind of question whether Mamdani would be in the position he is now if it weren't for Andrew Cuomo's baggage. But just like we saw kind of the evolution of the Democrats from the rise of the squad to a snapback towards electability in 2020 with Biden, I think there will be a huge emphasis on electability when Democrats are viewing their choice for 28.
Can you respond to that, Patrick? Because you're a big tent party, right? But tent poles. So who are the tent poles now? I mean, is there tension?
Well, there are so many ways to respond, but I want to bring up something, Jen, if I can filibuster for a second and bring up a thing that has not come up yet, right? So I'm listening to Dave, agree with much of what Dave says, though I do I'm one of those people who's of the opinion that candidates overwhelmingly matter, right? I remember the famous quote by Murray Kempton in 1965 when John Lindsay was running for mayor of New York, and he said, he's fresh and everyone else is stale. And Lindsay ended up putting that on his campaign posters, right? And it said something about that moment. You could have done that same thing in this election around Zohran Mamdani. He was fresh and everybody else was stale. You take away Andrew Cuomo's scandals, Andrew Cuomo was still doing the thing that Bill Clinton tells all candidates you should not do. Bill Clinton famously said, elections are always about the future. They are never about the past. Andrew Cuomo spent 11 months litigating the past, never giving any kind of affirmative vision for the future. He was stale and Mamdani was fresh and on the march. But there's also something else that we haven't talked about at all that I think is really important. I remember in 2007 into 2008, working for a skinny guy with a funny name from Chicago, who I believe would not have been able to get to first base against Hillary Clinton if not for Hillary Clinton's support for the Iraq War. I will tell you that there has been, in a very, very short amount of time, a seismic shift amongst Democratic voters, not just in New York, but nationally, around the question of Israel and Palestine. A huge, massive shift where you now have 70% of Democrats who have this negative impression of Israel in this moment. So you take that into this contest, I believe that you take that issue off the table, and Zohran doesn't manage in the first instance to kind of galvanize a lot of young Democratic registrants and those who later registered into the party for this primary without a sense that people felt misled, misdirected on this issue that they were deeply passionate about. And they admired his candor about it and his ability to kind of push back against the narrative that was coming from Andrew Cuomo and others on equating critique of Israel with anti-Semitism. It was a huge point of entry for Zohran that made it possible for so many others to get excited about his affordability message, et cetera. So that really matters here. Now, in terms of the polls in the party, this is a Big Ten party. Democratic Party is and will always be more diverse than the Republican Party is. However, the new Trump coalition presents some interesting challenges for the GOP as they try to, maintain a party now where they got higher than expected support from Latinos, from South Asians. That's going to create some complications for them when the downstream impact of the Medicaid cuts, all that stuff begins to cohere in the next year or two. But this is a wide party. It has been for a long time. However, it still really is dominated by the culture of the coast and has this really bad habit of trying to be all things to all people all the time. And so we end up with kind of alphabet soup messaging that which will fail more often than not against Project Simplify from the Heritage Foundation and others. It's a continuing challenge.
Hey, Mark, do you, commenting on picking up where Patrick left off there, what are your observations? You talk to more voters probably than anybody. I mean, you're everywhere all at once. You're all around the country. Does anything that he said resonate with you in terms of when you talk to voters outside of New York City, especially on the Israel-Palestine piece?
I think it's heavily generational. I talking to so many of my kids, friends, my colleagues' kids, who are all between the ages of 19 and 35, and there's no doubt about it that Bibi Netanyahu has become identified as Israel, and he's seen as kind of an adjunct of Trump in a lot of ways, right? And that's just been devastating, I think, to the perception of Israel for folks who are under 40. All they've known is Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu. Think about that. If you are a Gen Z, or like that's what you know, and that's a very different story than Camp David and Oslo, et cetera, et cetera. That's like a foreign language to them. So I think it's generational. I'll say this, though, because I've had a lot of people who say to me, mostly Republicans, but also some Democrats who are kind of bummed about the realignment on Israel, who say, Shapiro, oh, he's going to have a hard time, getting the nomination because he's Jewish. I'm kind of with David. I think Democrats are going to be so incredibly cold-eyed in 2028 about finding somebody who they think is going to be a viable candidate to take back the White House. I think the voters, and especially the early primary states, you guys know this, have become such little mini pundits, right? Like all of us have been to New Hampshire and Iowa and South Carolina. Like I can recall vividly voters coming up to me in 2019 and saying, it's going to be Biden Harris. It's like, what? She's still in the race, isn't she? I know, trust me on this. So I just think that the punditization of the early state voter and the hunger of Democrats to win and take back the White House, I think is gonna be the most dominating factor, more than any kind of purity test on the Middle East. And I think Patrick's right. I think candidates matter more than anything else. And the alphabet soup approach of trying to fix this and that with focus groups and polling and new approaches on message, fine. But you know what's going to fix it, though? A good dynamic candidate who's running in a favorable cycle. 1976, 1992, 2008. We've all seen the movie before. And I just think that's going to be the scenario again. And it's going to be a testament to who can emerge and who's got the chops as a kind of a great political athlete more than any kind of issue set, I think.
I want to go a little bit to pause a little bit on people and movements and what people see and don't see coming. I mean, I'm sure we all walked around Capitol Hill in 2016 and had Republican senators. I remember you had this J. Mart too look me in the eye and say, Donald Trump is not going to be our nominee. Not those, everyone who said that is either not in office or they're like, have been stumping for him ever since. So
yes.
Tea Party also, that was kind of like John Boehner, got in bed with the Tea Party in 2010 to win those elections and bring those 87 freshmen who created a sea change that's probably in many ways created the foundation for where we are with the party and Trumpism today, right? But that was kind of, and ended up becoming his own ouster, right? So is it possible that there is something going on in the Democratic Party right now, a realignment, and not based on purity tests? Maybe is it a warm populism instead of a snarling populism? Is the movement to more, quote, socialist economic policy something that really actually is a dynamic change?
Look, Jen. Oh, maybe that's a question for Dave. I'll let Dave respond, and then I'll jump in. Apologize for my interruption.
Well, there's a striking correlation between housing cost increases and voting patterns, and I think one thing we should really read into from the New York race, apart from the unique candidate dynamics and stale versus fresh, which I agree with you on. But where did Donald Trump improve by the most in 2024 versus 2020? It was the highest cost of living areas of the country. San Francisco, New York City. He improved by a lot in Massachusetts and New Jersey. And so Democrats, I think, are going to be paying a lot of attention to that, and particularly on Medicaid as we hit into 2026. That is an area where I think Democrats will cleave back a lot of voters who are just as concerned about healthcare access and the cost of healthcare as they are when it comes to the price of rent. But what I see now in the Democratic Party is we have a base that is very angry, not just at Trump, but at their own leadership for not doing enough. But what can Democrats do? They don't have political power right now. That's why I'm a bit skeptical of some of the Gen Z influencer candidates who are running primary campaigns against longtime incumbents. It's possible a few could succeed, but who are, at the end of the day, the voters in a lot of these Democratic primaries from district to district? It's still old people. And, take, for example, Illinois 9, where Kat Abu-Ghazala is running this progressive upstart campaign. She was running against Jan Schakowsky before Schakowsky decided to retire. But who are the voters in that district? It's less, activist Northwestern students. It's more old liberal people who have an established relationship with Dan Biss or Laura Fine. Some of the other districts I'd watch, as kind of Rorschach tests on this would be Connecticut 5, John Larson's race. Arizona 7, there's a special election coming up in a few weeks for Raul Grijalva's district. And even though his daughter is the front runner in that race, and as a progressive, there is a Gen Z influencer candidate, Deja Fox, who's a abortion rights activist who has a poll showing her close. If it is somewhat close, then maybe I give some of these progressive challengers more credibility.
So compositional makeup of the electorate matters a lot, right, Dave? It's everything. And Donald Trump was successful in 2016 and in 2024, essentially because he shifted the compositional structure of the electorate in his primary election and then in the general election. Some of us remember when the Republican Party, coming out of 2012, gathered around tables all around this country. They were wringing their hands and saying, we've got to do a thing to appeal better to women, to appeal to Latinos, to soften up the antipathy towards us with African Americans. And Donald Trump said, no, actually what we've got to do is figure out how we marshal a message and a campaign that's going to speak to disaffected voters who should be with us, who are not performing and not participating. His theory of the case proved to be right, and Reince Priebus was wrong. In New York, in this last election, Zohran Mamdani completely changed the composition of the electorate. You're right that more often than not, older voters dominate, but we just had an election where a full quarter of the early vote participants were under the age of 30. That's like an astonishing thing. On election day itself, I knew that Zohran was going to win when between 6 p.m. and 7:30 p.m., an hour and a half period, over 100,000 voters came out and participated. They were all from these precincts that you know these precincts well, in Williamsburg and some of the AOC turf in Queens. All these young folks who got off of work and immediately went out to participate. They were inspired. They were motivated by a thing. We changed the composition of the electorate. So these Gen Z candidates that you're talking about, Dave, will be successful or not successful if they can change that composition with message, because of their character and the overwhelming force of any ability to generate and grow a movement. Zohran had tens of thousands of volunteers that were knocking on doors, right? To go to your question, Jen, about this whole left and right divide and whether or not there's this polarity shift in the party that makes this a favorable environment for socialists, et cetera. I'm going to direct all of our attention to what happened in New York sometime early last year when we saw the horrific murder of the health insurance executive in Midtown Manhattan, broad daylight. There was this astonishing response to that murder that was not a left or a right response. Again, it was an outsider versus insider response. We saw all through social media. We saw at the water coolers in our offices, folks who were having a conversation about this person who was murdered as if he were, Beelzebub himself, right? People had all these nightmare stories about being denied, family members who had to give up their homes because they couldn't afford healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. That is so when Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both came out in their respective elections and said, this system is rigged against you, people on the left and the right were nodding. We're still in that the system is rigged against you ecosystem, and candidates who are Democrats, Republicans, of the left, of the right, or center better understand that and recognize that about the electorate if they hope to have any kind of success.
Now, Patrick is being modest, Jen. He was aware that Mamdani was going to win earlier than election night at 6 p.m. And it was striking to watch. I spent a decent chunk of the week before the election in New York, and outside of the TV airwaves, which Andrew had a lot of dominance on because of his money, you couldn't tell that there were any other candidates in the race. Don't forget, this was not a two-person race. There were, what, Patrick, 9, 10 candidates in the race.
Yep.
And just walking around the city, I spent a lot of time walking, just seeing the signs, the pamphlets, stickers, and most striking to me, the canvassers, the volunteer canvassers. I ran into 3 sets of canvassers walking through Harlem from about 145th Street to Central Park North, and they were all from Mamdani. Like, you wouldn't have thought there was anybody else running. His presence was incredibly ubiquitous on the ground. It was striking to see. Let me just introduce one thing on the national conversation, if I could. I'm looking for my phone here. I don't know. I think Mamdani did 2 things incredibly well that I think are going to be vital in 2028. One is he embraced an outsider ethos, running against the establishment, challenging first the incumbent mayor, Eric Adams, then challenging the kind of old guard with Andrew Cuomo, a dynastic name in New York. I think Democrats in 2028 are going to have to run against Washington. And he also did something else, too. Amazingly, Cuomo mocked this, but he broke through on social media. And I think whoever the Democratic nominee is in 2028, I don't know what faction of the party it's going to be, but I'll tell you this, that candidate's going to be able to do 2 things. One is they're going to be able to run against Washington and the status quo, same that Carter did, Clinton did, and Obama did. For my money, the 3 Democratic success stories that sort of tell the story of how Democrats win presidential elections. I think Biden's the exception that proves the rule, because Biden was a vehicle against Trump in 20. The Democrats who have won the presidency the last half century have all been outsiders running against Washington. Secondly, it's going to be somebody who can break through on the iPhone for 7 seconds and command your attention and be able to sort of keep you glued to your phone. You tell me who can do those 2 things, and I'll tell you who the nominee is going to be tomorrow.
By the way,
And it ain't anybody who's currently announced as a potential candidate for the presidency in
There it is.
2028.
Who can break through on this thing for 7 seconds, man? You tell me who can do that, right? Think about Donald Trump. I mean, the 79-year-old, in so many ways, a sort of old school guy, loves Time magazine covers. I mean, just old school, right? But I was still working at the New York Times. Jen will recall this too. So obsessed with the print placement. He and Chuck Schumer, they love print placement of stories. Where's it going to run? Above the fold or below the fold? I mean, but for all of his old school tendencies, Trump did for this, I think, what JFK did for TV and FDR did for radio. All right. How do you break through on this thing? He broke the internet when he put on the friggin' vest and hopped on the trash truck. And he did it again when he went to the McDonald's drive-through. I know it's gimmicky, but that stuff is sticky, right? Who can do that for Democrats?
talking about Gen Z, about what you all do and do not remember about the pre-Lucid government, Israel, how you're going to vote, who appeals to you, your own candidates. Luckily, we have a room full of them, and I'm going to let you all start asking questions in about 5 to 10 minutes here. So please start ruminating on your questions, what you want to ask. We're super lucky to have this panel here, so get your questions ready for them. Dave, were you going to comment on that? Did you have something to say about that, about the demographics?
Well, I think that is kind of a central problem, Jonathan, for some of the big brand names like Newsom and Pritzker. Do they have the ability to be fresh? Can they command in 7 seconds on an iPhone?
Right.
So the two Democrats who stand out in the House to me, and I cover the House for the Cook Political Report for the last 20 years, but there are two women under 40 who outperformed Kamala Harris by 8 points on the margin in their district. And those were AOC and Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez from Washington State. And they, have virtually, nothing in common in terms of where they stand within the Democratic Party, apart from, typically, but, MGP. She voted against Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. She condemned Kamala Harris's handling of the border. And then obviously AOC is a Democratic socialist.
Right.
But both have the authenticity factor and understand use social media to connect with their voters. And that's why I consider AOC as potentially just as formidable as, let's say, a Shapiro or Whitmer in the 2028 conversation.
Yep.
They do generate excitement just as much as kind of come out of electability central casting.
Yep.
I hate to break it to the exceptional students of the University of Chicago, but I've been involved in campaigns for local office and national office, and I have yet to meet a voter who actually cast their ballots on policy points at all, much to the consternation of Elizabeth Warren. So yeah, AOC and others have attentive currency, and they're going to be able to use it in any election that they participate in. And 1975, no one could have told you that Jimmy Carter was going to be the president of the United States in 1976. In 2000, Barack Obama couldn't even get a ticket to the Democratic National Convention. Donald Trump was a laughing stock in 2015, and yet he transformed his entire party. So I can guarantee you that somebody who we are not talking about at all right now is going to shock the heck out of everybody a few short years from now.
But your candidate talks about policy quite a bit, and in fact, that's put him at the
center.
My
candidate has a gift for performance, and I'm not using that performance in a kind of pejorative way. It's not, it's a performance that comes from under the skin. Watch the video that Zohran made in January of this year, where he goes around and he interviews halal truck vendors. They're selling their wares. He's talking to them about their food, but he's also talking to them about the onerous burdens on them as small business people. And then he talks to like the folks who are buying their food. And there's an aspect of that video that's about regulatory policy, but it's really about the power of the personality of Zohran. That's what that video is really about. If you watched it in January, you understood, oh, this guy is gonna take off. Personality matters, especially when you're running for executive positions. It matters less when you're running for Congress or a state Senate seat. It matters overwhelmingly when you're running for the president, for governorship, for the mayoralty.
So, and you had a bunch of candidates in that race. You didn't hate all of them. Spill some tea for us, Patrick. I mean, you play in that race? We didn't see your face necessarily out in the streets publicly.
You never see my face in any races that I've been involved in.
Jennifer
Steinhauer.
Does not work.
Look, I will tell you a couple of things. One, again, like when I'm involved in politics, I almost feel as if I'm working for a Hollywood studio and I've been sent out as a casting agent, because you have to like look to see who can break through the pain when you're like, and PANE, but also PAIN, right?
Yeah.
They're having conversations with folks and you're trying to see who is it that can kind of mobilize a kind of empathy, but as an alpha with like something in a muscular way that makes folks want to lean in and to stay like attentive to that individual. I saw that in Zohran pretty early on. The secret with Zohran in me is I first met him actually about 11 years ago when his mother, the iconic filmmaker Mira Nair, was releasing one of her movies, The Queen of Katwe. She was releasing it in Sub-Saharan Africa. I hosted her in Johannesburg when I was ambassador because of like a connection to another friend. And her 21-year-old son was a researcher on that film, and he came to the release in South Africa. And again, as I said, when you're around him for just a few minutes, you understand right away that this is somebody who has a thing that you can't define, that you can't even name, but you know he's got that thing. I think, Jen, I once told you the story about the first time I met Barack Obama. It was sometime in 2003. He was a state senator in Chicago, and he had the audacity to think that he should run for U.S. Senate. And he came to a meeting that I was in Cleveland, Ohio, and I thought, what's this guy got to tell me about organizing? We're trying to organize around the national elections at that point. 20 minutes after meeting him, I stepped out of the room and called my wife And I told her, I just met the guy who's going to be the first Black president of the United States. And she said, Baramba, what? But it just took a little while to realize this is somebody who can take really complicated things and speak to them through the sense of aspiration that most Americans have from the left, right, and the center. And I think that he can take, with his weird-ass history and biography and odd name, I think he can channel the American story for this new 21st century in interesting ways. I understood what the city of New York looked like in a way that was discordant from the city that Andrew Cuomo was describing and these other candidates were describing. They thought we were in a security moment in New York because that was the ethos coming out of the pandemic. We were no longer in that.
Yes.
25% of New Yorkers are living at the poverty level. The national average is 13%. It's 25% in New York, while the median income is rising exponentially in the city. So you have this tension playing out every day. And if you ride in the city away from the main arteries of Midtown Manhattan or from the Upper West Side or Upper East Side, you feel that, and you see the compositional change in the city that tells you that there are some new opportunities here. Just as if you go to Des Moines, Iowa today, you realize that there's a story we tell ourselves about Iowa, but if you go into a schoolyard, you realize, oh, the majority of school kids who are in the Des Moines public school system are children of color. What's that tension point that exists in the state of Iowa? How's that going to play out in the next 10 years? These are the things that as a political actor, you're looking for, both in the talent and in demography, to see how that comes together. And I could see it clearly here.
Well, you somewhat dodged my question, but that's okay. We have.
That's what I do.
That's awesome. All right, so now I'm gonna turn the mics over to this room, and it's because what we do, and we're here, and that's what we like to do. But in this case, I feel it's particularly important and special, and I hope you all step up here because there's been a lot of talk about your generation, and that even talking about the post-COVID voter, talking about people who are facing a difficult economy. That's all of you, right? That's you're all sort of the target voter in a sense for anyone who's running for office. To appeal to. So who's gonna break the ice with the first question? Just can you please speak loudly and say your name and your affiliation, your year, or what you have to do with Chicago.
Amazing.
Oh, you have a mic. Okay.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I am in the first half, I guess, of the Gen Z divide. I just turned 23 recently. I'm finishing out my first year as a physics PhD student here at the university. And I kind of had a couple questions, and I'll maybe just start with one end on this kind of sense of campaign strategy. On one end, Zohran Mamdani's videos, the things that went so vehemently viral that really grabbed that attention economy, they were so inextricably tied to the New York locality. How can you have that kind of strategy, that communication, and scale it up at that national sense? And I think tied to that end, I at least felt like, and granted, I am coming from this COVID hitting at like my senior year of high school period. Yeah. But I felt like Kamala Harris and Tim Walz had the attention economy for a period of time. Tim Walz was calling people weird. Kamala Harris had funny things on Twitter, had these Freedom by Beyonce playing in these campaign ads, and that message was tempered. That message was throttled effectively in part by the voter divide over Israel and Palestine as well. What's to say that you aren't going to get some national stage Zohran Mamdani and ruin him the way that people effectively ruined the Harris and Walz campaign?
Oh my God, I'm always intimidated by folks who are getting PhDs in physics, but now I'm especially intimidated. That's a great question. Do you mind, gentlemen, if I take the second half of that question about the Harris campaign and then let you guys take the nationalization of the digital stuff? So second half of that question. So I would say there were two Kamala Harris campaigns. There's the Kamala Harris campaign that begins the night that Joe Biden trips and falls on the debate stage, and then Kamala becomes like his official surrogate, saying Joe wasn't that bad, he's going to be okay, we're all going to be okay. That's the moment where a lot of national Democrats start looking at Kamala differently. She handles herself so incredibly well in that moment. So her campaign really begins there, and I think her campaign ends the night that I, with lots of other folks, were in Chicago, in an arena where she delivered, I thought, a fantastic alpha speech. Failed. I thought her campaign failed her in that moment because they actually did not take into account the kind of demobilizing impact that the decision not to have a Palestinian speaker would have on the base in that moment. It mattered more than people appreciated and understood. But there's that campaign from the moment that Biden fails to that fantastic speech. And then there's a second Harris campaign. She doesn't get the kind of bounce that her campaign hoped that she might coming out of the convention. It's like a slim bounce, and then Trump closes the gap. And then it felt to me as if the campaign choked and panic ensued, and they started running Joe Biden's campaign. They went from her talking about things like price gouging of big business and what she was going to do about it to suddenly shelving that and talking about democracy this, democracy that in a way that was kind of esoteric, not grounded in the concerns of average folk, and wasn't the least bit populist at all. She moved away, I thought, from a dynamic economic message that she was expressing right up into that convention, abandoned it, and never went back to it. I give this example of the Mark Cuban problem in the campaign. I was shocked when Mark Cuban and two other billionaire surrogates of Kamala Harris came out in public and said, I'm for Kamala Harris, but if she wins, she's got to fire Lena Khan. Can't have Lena Khan smacking down big companies in this country. Kamala Harris says nothing about it. Her campaign puts out a bunch of mealy-mouthed talking points about competition policy, and they moved on. But they were basically fenestrated by Cuban and defenestrated by Cuban and these other folks on that issue. Imagine Bill Clinton, Jonathan, Dave, 1992. If he's out there, he's campaigning, and some billionaire supporter of his tells him that he's got to like not have a cabinet post, go to somebody, he'd be out there saying, I love Mark Cuban. I'm so happy to have his support and his resources to get our message out. But let me tell you, I'm not letting Mark Cuban stand between me and you and fighting for your health care and fighting for lower grocery prices and fighting against big oil and big pharma. That's what a political athlete does in that moment. It leads into a kind of a populism in that moment that Kamala Harris and her campaign failed to do. And I felt as if they were hostage basically to the donor class.
Well, also, if we're getting real, there was no Tony West in Bill Clinton's ear in 1992. So.
Yep.
That's a deep cut, but it matters. Look, we can litigate the Kamala campaign. She was thrown into a difficult spot that I think, even though it was talented political athletes, would have had a hard time overcoming. Mostly because the right track, wrong track in the country was overwhelmingly on the wrong track, and they were the incumbent party. It's just hard to fix that, And there was a Trump amnesia about Trump's record, and there was a sense that things were better under Trump because folks had kind of forgotten the COVID times. So I'm just not sure.
All that I would agree with you with Jay Moore, but this was somebody who was twice convicted, thrice convicted.
I recall.
Whose closing argument on the campaign trail was about the organ size of a golfer. This happened. And we lost to that. So I just, like all that right track, wrong track stuff was right. But, there's the reality of the campaign shrinking the candidate in that moment that mattered. I'll let you guys answer the question about nationalizing the digital stuff, et cetera.
Who else?
Hey everybody, I'm Eli. I'm a public policy student over at the Harris School. I had a question about, you had referenced earlier Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's sort of similar situation, Democratic Socialist, New York primary, but that primary and has been kind of the prevailing trend in especially Democratic primaries, but even sometimes in generals, is that the leftmost candidate thrives in a low turnout environment, which that primary was. This primary was obviously a pretty high turnout primary. And I wonder if that is going to be the sort of prevailing wind in the future. What does that tell you about if you agree that it will, or if you agree that it won't? I saw Patrick shaking his head. What does that tell you?
It gets back to biographical more so than ideological, because in 2018, Joe Crowley was a 20-year incumbent who was from the old Queens machine. He was a white guy in a district that had become 80% non-white, right? And you have this young former bartender who was able to leverage her biography and connect it to meet the moment. And To your question about how do these candidates kind of how are they able to take that model and run with it in 2026? I think it's about running on biography. And there are a couple of Democrats that I'm watching who are running to take back the House in 2026, who are interesting people. You've got Joanna Mendoza in Arizona 6, who's a former Marine, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Bridget Brink, running against Tom Barrett in Michigan 7. Got a Lutheran minister named Sarah Trungariot in Iowa 3. You've got former Navy helicopter pilot Rebecca Bennett running against Tom Kaine in New Jersey 7. Kate Conley, former Marine in New York 17. So these are the types of biographies that also won Democrats back the House in 2018. And I think it was less so about left, right, and more so about being an outsider, having life experience that people can really get enthusiastic about, and package it into a video that starts clicks.
Dave, can I just I want to go back to something that Jonathan said that I think we shouldn't breeze over. We're spending for all the reasons one can understand, there's a lot of attention that's being paid to the digital campaign that Zohran ran, and how tech fluency is a challenge for the octogenarians who run Democratic Party. That's like all real. But Jonathan mentioned something that is not getting enough attention that for me is the bottom line here around this campaign. It speaks to the challenge and opportunity that exists for Gen Zers who are coming into politics. There are lots of tools in politics. Zohran used 2 of them really effectively. Yes, the new digital tools, but he also used the old-fashioned tools of shoe leather. Jonathan described coming across all these canvassers in Harlem and lots of places around the city. They went back to old-fashioned grassroots organizing. I was at Zohran's headquarters as they were launching the final canvas for the campaign. And they didn't just like bring a bunch of, the Democratic Party has evolved into this massive paid field operation where people are poorly trained, they're poorly motivated, they get some money to go hand out some flyers. Nobody was being paid on Zohran's campaign to go door knock, right? These were tens of thousands of mostly young people, but also some Bangladeshi aunties who were like going out and giving the best of themselves because they felt their own agency. When I'm at that canvassing training, the lead organizer is having a conversation with the volunteers and asking them, why are you participating? Why are you doing this? Come and put your sticky on the wall to let me know why. Somebody walks up and puts their sticky up. And what does the sticky says? It says, I'm doing this because I want my neighbors to feel wanted. Like that just ran through me. That's just like so powerful at a time when we are living atomized existences. When social isolation is as huge a problem in this society as healthcare, education, and all the other things that we usually focus on. It's a powerful thing. And when your generation is being accused of just like sitting in your phones all day and leading virtual existences, I saw overwhelmingly young people, Black, brown, Latino, Asian, going out and having the courage to get over their own anxiety and to knock on doors, even in neighborhoods where they knew more likely than not they were going to get a very, very hard no. I saw them campaigning on the Upper East Side, where you have folks who, let's just say, don't see eye to eye with Zohran Mamdani on any issue. And yet those young people went there and they gave the best of themselves because they wanted to be part of something that's bigger than themselves. That level of organizing that Jonathan mentioned matters, I think, at least as much as the digital tools. I think it matters a little bit more.
I want to try to get to 1 or 2 more questions. Thank you for that, Patrick. That was both career advice, organizing advice, and a little bit more window in the question you dodged before. We have a question back here. Please identify yourself if you could.
Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm going to be a 4th year at the college. I'm studying econ and computer science. And my question is that, so I come from like the wing of people, of voters who like subscribe to slow boring, which is obviously not like a super popular like type. It's not the type of voter that Mamdani was really reaching. But one of the things that Matt Iglesias talks about a lot is how like you want attention to be on things that are good issues for you and not on issues that are bad. And like a lot of the politicians that manage to engage activists like also seem to do that in a way that like scares away moderates. And New York is a special case because like Mamdani did not really have to contend with like he only had to win among registered Democrats, and like the kind of city's right-wing vote is split between Sliwa and Adams, neither of whom were in the primary, and Cuomo and all of the other like 20 candidates or something. And that's obviously not the case nationally. So like my question is like, how does a like activist, energetic, viral campaign avoid like setting off waves of virality in a way that ends up being ultimately damaging?
Can I just say I appreciate where the question comes from, and I respect slow, boring, and had like some lively conversations with Matt Iglesias about this stuff. I think you have to be careful about an oversimplification about what the New York electorate looks like. And we have to remember that New York voters moved 18 points more in Donald Trump's direction than they had previously, and Donald Trump had gains amongst urban voters in these blue cities. He made more progress in those districts than he made in the battleground state districts where billions of dollars were being spent. Important to note this about these voters. These are not folks who are like flaming progressives by any measure whatsoever. I do think that Zohran had the advantage of having this campaign being litigated on his central core issue of affordability, and might not have been as successful if the conversation could have been changed into more advantageous playing ground for Cuomo and some of the other moderates who were in that field. I think that I would refer you back to an experience that I had on this question of slow boring. I actually don't think that's how people work and how they're motivated. I keep thinking about the New Hampshire primary back in 2016 when I'm watching focus groups of voters in that open primary state who are telling the focus group interviewer that they love Bernie Sanders, they're for Bernie Sanders, they think they might go into the Democratic primary for Sanders, and the interviewer says, well, if you're not going to vote for Bernie, that means you're going to do Hillary, right? And they say, oh, no, not at all. If I don't do that, I'm going to go to the other Republican primary and support Donald Trump. And I'm watching this like with my mouth wide open thinking, how is that possible? How can somebody who's saying that they are for this thing also be for that thing? And I appreciate that we're living at a time when people have had to come through the Great Recession, where they saw, where the banks were going belly up, where homes were being foreclosed. They saw who was being rewarded on the back end of that and how they were being jerked around. They went through the great pandemic, which was really the great reveal about the economic polarization that exists in our country. I remember middle-class people who 2 weeks into the pandemic were lining up for hours for free food in food banks in Texas. And America likes to pretend that didn't happen to middle-class people in Texas during that period, but that was the really great reveal. I think that, people are living in a state of hyper insecurity. Donald Trump has been really brilliant at kicking over the centering tentpole for Republicans of freedom and replacing it with security, economic security, personal security, cultural security. I think Democrats who are successful right now, like Zohran, lean into that space of insecurity and speak to it in ways that can attract, yes, some activist voters, some younger voters, but some older voters. And I suspect increasingly some of the slow, boring crowd who also are like Linus holding on to his security blanket and ultimately terrified that the institutional Republicans or institutional Dems will yank that blanket away from them.
Yeah, I just think so much of this comes back to a quality candidate. I don't want to be a broken record here, and I don't want to be the old fogey talking about the old days, 2008, we covered the campaign. But like we've lived through this, a good quality candidate can overcome and repel attacks. The Clinton folks all through 07 and 08 said that Obama would be easy picking for the Republicans in the fall, and there was no way the country would ever elect him. And it's just not plausible, and like that was proven to be wrong. In part because Obama was an exceptional candidate. Also, in part, let's not forget, circumstances, a deeply unpopular war, an economy that was in free fall in the fall of 2008, also important. I just think a good candidate combined with the circumstances of Trump fatigue and the desire for something different is a powerful combination. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy. We're a divided country. Democrats are going to have a hard time winning the Senate, I think, anytime soon. And yeah, it's going to take like good luck in 3 states across the Big Ten. That's their path to the presidency these days, with Florida and Texas basically off the table. But I just think it's doable, the combination of the right candidate and favorable circumstances, because that's been the case for a long time.
Let's give you 60 seconds. I want to give
Back to our slow boring readers, question about the danger of virality. I think it depends on the election format, because keep in mind that if you're able to make the election about yourself in a 9-way field, that's a really big advantage, because you're sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And, for all the controversy about what Zohran said when he was 20 or 21, right? If you're making a referendum on that and you've got at least 35% of people really enthusiastically behind you, that's enough to do very well in this ranked choice format, right? And same thing with Donald Trump in 2016. He was in a 9-way field with a crowd of politicians, and he began with 30% favorability among Republican voters. And yet by making it a referendum on himself, 30% was enough to win a lot of primaries. It's a different calculation in a general when it's head to head. And when Trump was able to make the election a little bit more about Kamala than himself by virtue of his campaign's negative ads, that's when the race really started to turn a little bit in his favor in October.
Okay, if you can ask a quick question, we're gonna try to get a quick answer for you. You can have the last one.
Okay, perfect. When Patrick was talking about
Say your name and
my name is Manal. I'm from the Public Policy School. I'm a second year. And I was kind of thinking, when Patrick brought up the canvassers in New York, sort of making the volunteers feel like they had a very personal connection to that campaign. We did that in Texas in 2018 with Better or Worse Senate campaign, where when we would kind of bring in the volunteers, we would really ask them, like, why are you here? Why does this matter to you? But I fail to really see that kind of engagement with young people when it comes to a more national or like larger scale campaign. And especially with like the old guard Dems, they do still subscribe to that belief that like, no, voters are always old. And it's simply not true anymore. Like we've time and time again play out in those races, right? That like, if it's Zohran, if it's Beto, or like anybody else, how can they kind of take those lessons and really like implement them at that scale and really get away from that core belief that like young people are not really, invested, or they're apathetic about it, because it simply just isn't true anymore.
It happened for Obama in 2008 on a national scale.
There we go, back to 2008, yeah.
The Democrats haven't been able to
Yes, since, right? Like for like now for us, I think that was when we were.
Yeah, I know. That was
Patrick,
17 years
you're
ago.
laying out the groundwork for us, so we'll give you 60 seconds for the last word and it seems like she's asking for advice from someone affiliated with the party.
Yeah, so I'm affiliated with the party. I'm former executive director of the DNC, and I've worked like for Democratic candidates all over the place. But I want to be careful about something and clear to you all. I'm affiliated with the party. I'm not of the party. I come up through organizing, right? I'm a former labor activist. I'm a former social justice activist and international solidarity activist. I note that because I think that my organizing informed my involvement in the party. My first presidential campaign was for Jesse Jackson in 1988. And for us, it wasn't about like electing a candidate. It was about building a movement that then could hold Democrats accountable and to kind of change the rules of engagement in the party. I think that your generation has an obligation to itself to change the habits of the political class by organizing amongst yourselves and organizing beyond yourselves. The last time I was at the University of Chicago in person, and had this conversation, Jen, I remember somebody in the audience saying to me that they were worried about going places where they would feel not that safe, like West Virginia, to go and have the conversations about the future of this country. I want to challenge all of you who care about your country, who care about your community, to kind of get up and go into places like the West Virginias to talk about your affirmative vision of the future as we get into the 250th anniversary of America next year. And I think you're going to be surprised to find the kind of alignment that exists out there and the communities that are available to you if you dare to organize in a way that will then condition a different kind of behavior from my friends like, I don't know, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and a bunch of other people.
Thank you for that.
Here, here. Great to see you guys.
Great to see you.
Fun to be on with y'all. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, UFC Maroon. See you, Patrick. Later, guys.
See you, J. Martin. Later.
Bye, and thanks to all of you for coming out and in July.